Thank you for listening to the public hearing presentation for Snapper Grouper Amendment 53 for gag and black grouper. My name is Allie Iverly and I am the staff contact for this amendment. Public comment is a crucial part of the council process, and the purpose of this hearing is to gather your input on the council's proposed actions and preferred alternatives in this amendment. Your input will help shape the council's final decisions on this amendment. Before I start, I want to review the order that I will run through the information tonight. First, I will review the amendment in its entirety. Next, I'll stop and answer any clarifying questions on the information that I reviewed. And finally, and most importantly, a council member is on the call to take your comment. There's other ways that you can submit comment for this amendment, and we'll review those at the end of the presentation. Start with a really quick review about the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. SAFMC is one of 8 regional fishery management councils. We're headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina. The council's jurisdiction ranges from 3 to 200 miles offshore from the North Carolina-Virginia border down through the Florida Keys. The council is made up of recreational and commercial fishermen, state marine agency reps, and federal partners. The council has 17 members, 13 voting and 4 non-voting, and it includes representatives from each state in the region. The council's main job is to provide recommendations to NOAA fisheries. All right, I'm going to dive right into the information for Snapper Grouper Amendment 53. This amendment was started after the South Atlantic stock of gag was assessed in 2021 through CDR 71. The results of that assessment indicated that the stock is both overfished and experiencing overfishing. Because of that stock status, an approximately 70% decrease in harvest is needed to achieve catch levels that will help to end overfishing. Black grouper was added to this amendment due to concerns over identification issues, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the actions that pertain to black grouper. First, I want to talk a little bit about overfished and overfishing status and what the difference is between those two stock statuses. The overfished status indicates that the stock biomass is below the minimum stock size threshold, or MSST, whereas the overfishing status indicates that the rate of fishing is above the maximum fishing mortality threshold, or MFMT. So think of overfished status pertaining to the stock and whether or not the biomass of the stock is large enough to support sustainable harvest, whereas overfishing pertains to the rate of fishing and whether or not that is sustainable. So what changes are proposed in Amendment 53? Like I mentioned, there are actions in this amendment that pertain to both gag and black grouper. I'll be reviewing these in 2 chunks, starting with gag. First and foremost, this amendment will establish a rebuilding plan for gag. It will adjust the acceptable biological catch, or ABC, the total annual catch limit, or ACL, and optimum yield, or OY. It will revise sector allocations and sector annual catch limits, modify the commercial trip limit, establish a recreational vessel limit, and modify the captain and crew bag limit. Those are the actions that will pertain to gag. There are 2 actions that will pertain to black grouper, and those are establishing a recreational vessel limit and modifying the recreational captain and crew bag limit. Before I go into the details on each action in this amendment, I want to go over the timeline really quickly. So this amendment started around June of 2021 when the council reviewed the stock assessments from CDR 71. That's where we got that overfished and overfishing stock status determination. In February of 2022, we held scoping sessions and relayed those comments to the council. And that brings us to this public hearing. The comments we gathered during this hearing, we will relay to the council in March, where they'll review your comment and then approve the amendment for formal review. And we can expect implementation of a final rule in mid to late 2023. Now that we've reviewed the background and timeline for this amendment, I'm going to go through the details of each action. Action 1 will establish a rebuilding plan for gag. Because the stock is overfished and experiencing overfishing, A rebuilding plan is required under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. This action contains three alternatives. Alternative 1, no change, would not establish a rebuilding plan and is therefore not a viable alternative. Alternative 2 would establish a rebuilding plan with a time frame of 7 years. 7 years is the time frame in which the stock could rebuild in the absence of fishing mortality, and therefore is the shortest time frame for rebuilding. Preferred alternative 3 sets a rebuilding plan with a time frame of 10 years, which is the maximum time frame. Under National Standard 1, if the stock is projected to rebuild in under 10 years in the absence of fishing mortality, then the rebuilding plan may not exceed 10 years. Action 2 will revise the acceptable biological catch, or ABC, total annual catch limit, or ACL, and annual optimum yield, or OY, for gag. So why are these levels being updated? So they will incorporate both the best available science and the updated recreational landings estimates. So the SSC, or Science and Statistical Committee, reviewed that assessment that we talked about earlier and recommended a new ABC and OFL, which were then deemed best available science. These catch levels will also incorporate updated recreational landings estimates from the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP's Fishing Effort Survey. So if you've been involved in the council process, you may have heard the CHTS and FES acronyms talked about when the council talks about recreational landings estimates. So in 2018, the Coastal Household Telephone Survey, or CHTS method, was replaced with the MRIP FES, or Fishing Effort Survey method, due to the dwindling number of landline phones. So the FES survey is considered more accurate and to contain less bias, and is therefore the method in which recreational landings will be estimated moving forward. Action 2 contains 4 alternatives with a range of different catch levels that include either no buffer or different buffers between the annual catch limit, or ACL, and the acceptable biological catch, or ABC. This buffer between these two catch levels can account for management uncertainty and help to contribute to rebuilding. However, the council is not required to set a buffer between these two catch levels. They just cannot set the ACL above the ABC. Alternative 1 would set the ACL and OY, or optimum yield, equal to the current ABC. So the current ABC is not considered best available science since it incorporates recreational landings estimates from the Coastal Household Telephone Survey. Therefore, alternative 1 is not a viable alternative. The council's current preferred alternative of alternative 2 would set the annual catch limit in OY equal to the updated ABC, which is inclusive of those recreational landing estimates from the Fishing Effort Survey. Alternative 3 and Alternative 4 would create a 5% and 10%, respectively, buffer between the ACL and OY and ABC. This chart here, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. This shows you the catch levels compared to Alternative 1 for each of the alternatives under Action 2. This table and some more details about these catch levels are included in your public hearing document in the briefing book for this hearing. This figure shows a comparison of the average total landings of gag, commercial and recreational, from 2015 to 19 compared to the proposed ACLs under the preferred alternative for Action 2. So preferred alternative was setting the ACL and OY equal to the updated ABC. As you can see, from 2023 to 2027, the proposed ACLs are below the average landings from 2015 to 19, so we can assume that these catch levels will be constraining on harvest. However, in 2028, throughout the rest of the rebuilding plan, these ACLs exceed the average landings from 2015 to 19, so we can expect these catch levels to be less constraining or not constraining on harvest during these years. Action 3 will revise the gag sector allocations and sector annual catch limits. So allocations are being updated to include 2 things: the updated catch levels from Action 2, which are the best available science, and the updated recreational landings estimates. Alternative 1 would retain the 51% commercial, 49% recreational allocation. This allocation was determined through Amendment 16 in 2008, and it used the landings distributions from 1999 to 2003. However, the recreational landings estimates used in this calculation were from that coastal household telephone survey. Alternative 2 would essentially take this same calculation and recalculate it, incorporating those FES recreational landings estimates. When you run those numbers, you get a 36.37 commercial allocation and a 63.63% recreational allocation. Alternative 3 uses the Comp ACL amendment allocation formula, which you can see there. That results in a 43.06% commercial allocation and a 56.94% recreational allocation. Preferred Alternative 4 is a novel allocation method that was developed in December of 2021. This method reduces each sector's ACL proportional to their landings, either based on a 3-year average for subalternative 4A or a 5-year average, preferred subalternative 4B. And then each year, as the catch limit increases, the increase is split evenly between the sectors. Because of that, the allocation percentage for each sector changes yearly. I'm going to go through a detailed example of how this allocation method operates on the next slide. To understand how preferred subalternative 4B works, we put together a simple example so you can follow how the method works from start to finish. So the basis for this allocation is average landings for 5 years for each sector from 2015 to 2019. So in this example, the commercial sector, say they landed 100,000 pounds on average from 2015 to 19, whereas the recreational sector, again in this example, landed, say, 200,000 pounds from 2015 to 19. When you total that, you have a total average landings from 2015 to 19 of 300,000 pounds. While landings based on that 5-year average from 2015 to 19 have been 300,000 pounds, a reduction in harvest is needed to reach the updated harvest level for year 1, which is 75,000 pounds. So we need to get from 300,000 pounds to 75,000 pounds. So compared to that 5-year total average, a 75% reduction in harvest would be needed to achieve the new catch level in year 1. So how will this allocation method achieve the 75% reduction in harvest? So in year 1 of this method, each sector will share the initial reduction. Because of the 75% reduction needed, each sector will take a 75% reduction proportional to their 5-year average landings. So commercial year 1, the ACL will be 25,000 pounds. So we took that initial 100,000 pounds and reduced it by 75%. And then the same thing with the recreational. So their year 1 ACL would be 50,000 pounds. So we took that 200,000 pounds and we reduced it by 75%. From there, we calculated an allocation percentage. So think of the percentage as an aftermath of the calculation in the initial reduction. So the allocation percentage you end up with is 33% commercial and 67% recreational. Now also keep in mind, those percentages are based on this example only. These are not the percentages for the gag fishery. So after that initial reduction, the total ACL increases each year throughout the rest of the rebuilding plan. What this allocation method does is it splits the increase in pounds between each sector each year. So we started at that really reduced 75,000 pound total ACL. So in year 2, we bump up to 160,000 pounds. So it's an increase in 85,000 pounds from year 1 to year 2. So we chop that 85,000 pounds in half, and that gives you 42,500 pounds for each sector. So the commercial in year 1 was at 25,000 pounds. They get to add 42,500 to that, and they get 67,000 500 pounds in year 2. Same thing with the recreational. They were at 50,000 pounds. Add on that 42.5 and you're up to 92,500 pounds in year 2. The allocation percentage, like in year 1, changes slightly, so that ends up being a 42% allocation to the commercial and a 58% allocation to the recreational. So again, think of this as an allocation in poundage, which then results in a changing percentage allocation. So same thing for year 3. Year 3, we go from 160,000 pounds to 247,000 pounds. So that split in half is 43,000, or that increase is 87,000 pounds. Split in half is 43,500. So same thing. You're adding that poundage for each sector onto the ACL from the previous year. So you're building each year. And again, you can see the percentage allocation changes. We're now at a 45% commercial, 55% recreational. Year 4, same thing. We're going from 247,000 pounds to 333,000 pounds total, so an increase of 86,000. We split that 86,000 in two. You have 43,000 even for each sector to enjoy. Allocation percentage changes again, so we have 46% for the commercial and 54% for the recreational, and one final year to follow here. So we go from 333,000 pounds to 422,000 pounds. So a gain of 89,000 pounds. Again, split is 44,500. So you can see how each year builds on the previous year. Again, we're allocating the poundage, which then results in a coordinating allocation percentage. So what do the actual numbers look like for GAG? How do those percentages shake out? So this table shows both the commercial and recreational ACLs in pounds gutted weight, and then the commercial and recreational percentages. So I'm not going to go over every value in this table, but I did want to show how these allocation percentages change. So in year 1, we start off with a 49% commercial allocation and a 51% recreational allocation. However, by 2027, this evens out to a 50-50 allocation and remains that way for the rest of the rebuilding plan. I also want to note that in 2032, the commercial and recreational ACLs in pounds gutted weight and allocation percentage will be locked in place until modified. This table shows the season length analysis under preferred subalternative 4B, that 5-year average shared reduction allocation method. Because of the length of the analysis, we conducted a kind of a bookend analysis where we looked at year 1, 2023, 2027, which is kind of the middle of the road, and then the final year of the rebuilding plan in 2032. So for the recreational sector, year 1 catch levels are expected to be pretty constraining on harvest. So for both sectors, there is a shallow water grouper spawning season closure. That closure ends May 1, so the season opens May 1 and is expected to close in 2023 around the middle of June for the recreational sector, and then around the end of June for the commercial sector. In 2027, there's expected to be an end of October closure for the recreational sector. However, no closure expected for the commercial sector by 2027. Looking out to the end of the rebuilding plan, catch levels are no longer expected to be constraining on harvest for either sector. Action 4 will modify the commercial trip limit for GAG. Trip limit modifications are being considered to achieve the reduction in harvest needed to constrain the catch to the updated commercial ACL while maintaining an extended commercial season. So trying to maintain access with those reduced catch levels. So alternative 1 would retain the 1,000-pound gutted weight trip limit until 75% of the commercial ACL is met, and then that trip limit would be reduced to 500 pounds. Alternative 2 is a 200-pound trip limit. Preferred alternative 3 is a 300-pound trip limit, and alternative 4 and 5 is a 400 and 500-pound trip limit, respectively. Alternative 6 would start with a 300-pound trip limit in 2023, increase to 500 pounds gutted weight in 2026, and then finally to 1,000 pounds gutted weight in 2027 and thereafter until modified. And we'll get into more details on that alternative on the next slide. Alternative 6 under Action 4 was developed based on years when, according to the projections, the commercial ACL would not be met and therefore could be increased. So as that commercial ACL increases, under this alternative, the trip limit would increase as well. This table shows you how those years were developed. So under the updated catch levels and the preferred alternative for the allocations action and the 300-pound trip limit, from 2023 to 2025, the commercial ACL is projected to be met. However, in 2026, the commercial ACL is not expected to be met, and therefore the trip limit is increased. The figure on the left shows the pounds of gag harvested per trip from 2017 to 2019. And as you can see, 83% of trips harvested anywhere from 1 to 250 pounds of gag per trip. The table on the right shows that season analysis for the preferred alternative of a 300-pound gutted weight trip limit. So in 2023, just due to the nature of the reductions in harvest needed in that year one, even with that 300-pound trip limit, it's expected to be constraining on harvest. So a mid-July closure expected there. However, in 2027 and then throughout the rest of the rebuilding plan, there's no commercial closure expected with the 300-pound gutted weight trip limit. Action 5 will modify recreational management measures for gag. This action is split into two sub-actions. Sub-action 5A will establish a recreational vessel limit, and sub-action 5B will prohibit the retention of gag by captain and crew. Sub-action 5A establishes a recreational vessel limit for gag. A vessel limit is being considered, again, like the commercial trip limit, to constrain recreational harvest to the updated recreational ACLs while maintaining recreational access. Alternative 1, no change, would retain the current 1 fish per person per day bag limit. The next 4 sub-alternatives split things between the recreational components, so either the private recreational component or the for-hire component, which includes charter and headboat. Preferred sub-alternative 2A would impose a 2 fish per vessel per day limit for the private recreational component. Subalternative 2B would impose a 4 fish per vessel per day limit on the private recreational component. Preferred subalternative 3A would impose a 2 fish vessel limit per trip for for-hire boats. Subalternative 3B would put a 4 fish vessel limit per trip on for-hire boats. So essentially, the Council has preferred a 2 fish vessel limit per day for the private recreational component and per trip for the for-hire component. The figure on the right shows the distribution of gag harvested per vessel trip for the private, charter, and headboat components from 2017 to 2019. The gray bars indicate private vessels, the black charter vessels, and then the white are headboat vessels. As you can see, the majority of vessels are harvesting 1 gag per trip, with some vessels harvesting 2, 3, and 4 gag per trip. The table on the right is the predicted percent change in landings per trip when compared to the current 1 fish per person per day bag limit. So obviously alternative 1 would see no change. Preferred alternative 2 would result in a 20% decrease for the private vessel component. Preferred alternative 3A would see a 13% reduction for charter vessels and a 30% reduction for headboat vessels. Subaction 5B would prohibit the retention of gag by captain and crew. This prohibition is being considered to further constrain recreational harvest to the updated catch levels and again help to contribute to rebuilding. This action has 2 alternatives. Alternative 1, no action, which would allow captain and crew to retain the daily recreational bag limit as allowed for each passenger. Preferred alternative 2 would reduce the captain and crew bag limit to 0. Action 6 will modify the gag recreational accountability measures, or AMs. This is being considered to prevent recreational landings from exceeding the recreational ACL and correct for any overages if they occur. So recreational accountability measures are being modified for several species within the snapper grouper complex to make sure that they're more timely and efficient, especially for seasons that are shorter, which is expected in the first couple of years of the rebuilding plan because of the constraint in harvest. I'm going to use this table to walk through each of the accountability measure alternatives, but I like to think of accountability measures, or AMs, as you see in this chart, in two chunks, the in-season and the post-season. So the current accountability measures under Alternative 1, no action, does contain an in-season AM. So if the recreational landings reach or are projected to reach the recreational ACL, the current season closes. Under the current AMs, there's also a post-season trigger that's dependent on three things: the recreational landings exceeding the recreational ACL, the total ACL being exceeded, and the stock status as overfished. All three of those things must occur for the AM to take effect. And that post-season accountability measure is the recreational ACL for the following year is reduced by the recreational overage, and the recreational season for the following year is reduced by the amount of the recreational overage. Alternative 2 is kind of completely different. In this alternative, National Marine Fisheries Service will annually announce the recreational fishing season start and end date. So this would operate kind of like the black sea bass season. Alternative 3 would remove the post or the in-season AM. So no longer would there be a closure in the current season. And then in the postseason, it would essentially uncouple. So it would take those three triggers and remove the total ACL and the stock status trigger. So the only thing that would trigger the postseason accountability measure would be the recreational landings exceeding the recreational ACL. So that's what would trigger the postseason AM for Alternative 3. Preferred Alternative 4 is a mashup of the current AM, so Alternative 1, and Alternative 3. So it would retain that current in-season AM where the recreational landings reach or projected to reach the ACL, so your current season would still close. However, it would also uncouple the postseason. So instead of those three triggers, you would only need the recreational landings exceeding the recreational ACL to trigger the AM, which would be the recreational season for the following year is reduced by the amount necessary to prevent the recreational ACL from being exceeded. Action 7 and its two respective sub-actions modify the recreational management measures for black grouper. So black grouper entered this amendment in September of 2022 after the council discussed identification issues between the two species. The Law Enforcement Advisory Panel also discussed identification issues in February of 2022. Currently, the recreational management measures for GAG and black grouper mirror each other, so the council would like to keep this consistent moving forward. The council does not have intentions to modify any commercial management measures for black grouper. So subaction 7A would establish a recreational vessel limit, and subaction 7B would prohibit the retention of black grouper by captain and crew. So this subaction should look familiar. It essentially mirrors subaction 5A, but for black grouper. Again, this subaction was included because of identification issues and wanting to maintain consistency between recreational management measures for GAG and black grouper. So the current preferred alternatives for subaction 7A are preferred alternative 2A, which establishes a 2 fish per vessel per day for the private recreational component, and then preferred alternative 3A, which establishes a 2 fish per vessel per trip limit for the for-hire component. The figure on the right is similar to the one that we looked at for the GAG vessel limit. It shows the number of black grouper harvested per vessel for each of the three recreational components. And for black grouper, we're seeing kind of even more vessels harvesting one black grouper per vessel, with the exception of headboat, where you see a little bit more spread, where some vessels are catching 2, 3, and 4 fish. The top table on the left shows the predicted change in landings for private vessels and for hire. So alternative 2, that preferred alternative 2 per vessel, we see about a 6% decrease for private, and then around a 24% decrease for hire. The bottom table is essentially a summary of how much of the ACL has been harvested in recent years for the black grouper fishery, recreational fishery. So from 2017 to 2021, an average of 47% of the ACL has been harvested. So this just shows that this fishery hasn't been harvesting 100% of its ACL. We're right under half. So subaction 7B is the last action within this amendment, and it looks similar, again, mirrors subaction 5B, and it would prohibit the retention of black grouper by captain and crew. Again, we're considering this action over identification issues between gag and black and wanting to constrain harvest and keep the recreational management measures consistent between the species. So there's two alternatives for this subaction. Alternative 1, the captain and crew can retain the daily limit of black grouper. And then preferred alternative 2, where the black grouper bag limit for captain and crew would be 0. Wraps up my review of Amendment 53 for gag and black grouper. I'm going to pause quickly and go over any clarifying questions, and once we answer any questions, we will pause and take public comment.